The dial tone didn't click. It didn't beep. It didn't signal the end of the world, but it should have. Ellen Ripley stared at the glowing screen of the hotel's internal cordless phone, her thumb hovering just a fraction of an inch above the end call button. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs, slamming against bone and breath. The lobby of the Grand Pierre was a tomb of polished marble and gold leaf, the silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing the very air out of her lungs. He had just said it. He had said it all. Every forbidden thought, every feverish dream she'd tucked away in the dark corners of her mind for the last 6 months, had just been broadcast through the digital ether. And the line was still open. "Hello to all of you beautiful souls joining me today," Ellen whispered, her voice trembling as she looked into the camera of her own mind, imagining the faces of those watching her life unfold like a slow-motion wreck. "I'm so grateful to have you here. Before we descend further into this nightmare, please, let me know where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. It means the world to me to have you by my side through stories like this." The receiver in her hand felt like a live wire, pulsing with a current that threatened to incinerate her. 5 floors up in the Imperial Suite, the room that didn't exist on the public floor plan, the phone was off the hook. She knew this because she had been the one to patch the call through to the private lounge for the man who haunted her every waking hour. John McClane, a name that carried the weight of a death sentence in the underworld and the scent of expensive bourbon and cold rain in her fantasies, was on the other end. Ellen's vision blurred. The rich, sensory details of the lobby, the cloying scent of lilies, the hum of the central air conditioning, the distant chime of the elevator, all vanished. There was only the static on the line. She remembered the way he had walked past the desk 20 minutes ago. He hadn't looked at her. He never did. He was a pillar of shadow and tailored wool, his presence a gravity well that dragged everyone's gaze toward the floor. He was a man who moved with the silent, lethal grace of a predator who knew he was at the top of the food chain. She was the girl who fixed his key cards, the girl who kept her head down, the girl whose hands shook so violently when he was near that she had to hide them beneath the mahogany counter. I want to know what it feels like," she had whispered into the phone to her friend Sarah, thinking she was speaking into a void. "To have those hands, the ones that look like they could break a man's neck without a second thought, just hold me. I want to hear him say my name, not key card, or towels. I want to be the reason he stops looking at the world like it's a chessboard and looks at me like I'm the only thing that matters. I'm obsessed, Sarah. It's pathetic. I dream about him every single night. I dream about the way he smells, like cedar and danger. I think I'd let him ruin my life if he just looked at me once with heat instead of ice." The silence on the other end of the line wasn't empty. It was listening. It was a heavy, predatory silence. The kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Ellen's breath hitched. A soft, rhythmic sound began to leak through the receiver. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the white noise of a disconnected line. It was the slow, deliberate sound of a man exhaling. A deep, gravelly breath that vibrated in her ear, making the hair on her arms stand up. Then a click. Not the disconnect click. The sound of a glass being set down on a glass table. "Ellen." The voice was a low rumble, a dark velvet caress that bypassed her ears and settled straight in the base of her spine. It was him. He wasn't just on the line, he was there. He had heard it all. The longing, the desperation, the raw, unvarnished truth of a girl who had fallen in love with a monster. Her name. He had said her name for the first time. And it sounded like a promise of total destruction. How long had he been listening? Had he heard the part about his hands? The part about her wanting him to ruin her? The realization hit her like a physical blow, sending her stumbling back against the mail slots. She had stripped her soul bare for a man who killed for a living. And now the predator was no longer ignoring the prey. The line finally went dead with a sharp final beep. Ellen dropped the handset. It clattered onto the marble floor, the sound echoing through the empty lobby like a gunshot. She was alone in the vast golden cage of the Pierre, but she had never felt more watched. She looked up at the gold-plated numbers above the elevator. The needle was moving. 5, 4, 3. He was coming down. What does a man like John McClane do when he finds out the quiet girl at the front desk is harboring a lethal romantic obsession with him? Does he laugh? Does he find it a liability? Or does he take exactly what she offered? The elevator needle continued its agonizingly slow descent. But for Ellen Ripley, time had already fractured. Every second felt like a year spent in a cold, dark room. To understand the sheer terror vibrating through her bones, one had to understand that Ellen was a woman built of shadows. She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of being invisible. Raised in a series of foster homes where the quietest child was the one who didn't get hit, she had learned to move like a ghost. Her deepest desire wasn't wealth or fame. It was simply to be seen by someone who wouldn't hurt her. But her deepest fear? That was being seen for exactly who she was. A woman starving for affection, hiding a heart that beat with a dangerous, rhythmic intensity. She was 24, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and hair she kept scraped back in a tight, professional bun that gave her headaches. Her life was a cycle of 12-hour shifts, lukewarm coffee, and a studio apartment that smelled of jasmine incense and loneliness. She was the reliable one. The one the manager, Biff Tannen, constantly exploited because he knew she wouldn't talk back. Biff was a man of sweat and cheap cologne, the kind of person who took pleasure in the small cruelties of middle management. Ripley. The brass in the Imperial Suite wants their shoes shined by 6 a.m. Don't screw it up or it's your job, he'd barked earlier that evening, leaning over her desk until she could see the broken capillaries in his nose. Ellen had just nodded, her eyes fixed on her sensible black flats. She took the abuse because the Grand Pierre was her sanctuary. It was a palace of secrets and she was the keeper of the keys. But then 6 months ago the secrets got a face. John McClane didn't just walk into the hotel. He rearranged the atmosphere of it. The first time she saw him, the air had turned metallic, tasting of ozone. He was a man built of sharp angles and hidden depths, his suits costing more than Ellen made in 3 years. He was the silent sun around which a dark galaxy revolved. His associates, men like the cold-eyed Vincenzo Corleone, never left his side, yet John always seemed fundamentally alone. Vincenzo was the muscle, a man whose tailored jacket couldn't hide the bulk of a shoulder holster, but John was the mind. He was the one who decided who lived and who went missing. He was a kingpin, a phantom of the city's concrete veins, a man whose hands were stained with things Ellen couldn't even imagine. And yet she had fallen. Not for the power, but for the moments of humanity she caught when he thought no one was looking. She'd seen him once, late at night, pausing by a piano in the mezzanine. He hadn't played, but he had touched the keys with a reverence that was almost painful to watch. She'd seen him tip a homeless man outside the entrance $100 bill without breaking his stride or looking for thanks. She saw the loneliness in him because it was the mirror image of her own. "You're doing it again," Sarah's voice had teased her over the phone just minutes before the disaster. Sarah was the only person who knew the truth. They had met at a community college art class 3 years ago. Sarah was the fire to Ellen's ice, a bold, loud-mouthed waitress who lived for the drama Ellen avoided. "You're pining for the Prince of Darkness again, aren't you? Honey, he's a shark. You're a goldfish. He'll eat you just because he's bored." "He's not a shark," Ellen had whispered back, her voice blooming with a warmth she only allowed herself in the dark. He's a storm. And I've spent my whole life being a sturdy house. I just want to know what it's like to let the roof blow off for once. I want to feel the wind." She had spent months cataloging him. She knew he liked his coffee blacker than sin. She knew he preferred the corner table in the lounge because it gave him a view of every exit. She knew he had a scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, a jagged silver line that made her want to reach out and trace it with her thumb. She was a voyeur of a life she could never lead. Her motivation was simple. She wanted to be the one person in the world who wasn't afraid of him. She wanted to be the one person he didn't have to perform for. But now, the foundation of her quiet, safe obsession had crumbled. The wall she'd built between her reality and her fantasy had been demolished by a single unpressed button. The elevator bell chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that felt like a mockery. The doors slid open. The lobby was vast, but as John McClane stepped out, it felt like the walls were closing in. He wasn't flanked by Vincenzo this time. He was alone. His coat was open, his silk tie loosened at the throat, giving him a look of raw, unkempt power. He didn't head for the exit. He headed for the desk. Every step he took on the marble floor sounded like the beat of a war drum. Ellen felt the urge to run, to bolt through the service entrance and never look back, to leave her coat, her job, and her life behind. But her legs were lead. She stood paralyzed, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so hard her knuckles turned white. He stopped 3 feet away. The scent hit her first, expensive tobacco, sandalwood, and something cold like mountain air. Close, he was overwhelming. The shadows beneath his eyes hinted at a man who hadn't slept in days, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. He looked at the bun in her hair, the cheap polyester of her uniform, the way her pulse was jumping in the hollow of her throat. He was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time, not as a fixture of the lobby, but as the woman who wanted his hands on her. "The line was open, Ellen," he said. His voice was lower than it had been on the phone, a subterranean growl that made her knees buckle. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers tracing the edge of the phone she had dropped. I'm so sorry, Mr. McLean," she gasped, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I didn't mean. It was a mistake. I was just talking to a friend. I wasn't thinking. I'll resign. I'll leave right now. You think I'd let you leave after hearing that?" he interrupted. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was trapped between his massive frame and the mail slots. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You said you wanted to know what it felt like to have these hands on you." He didn't touch her skin. Not yet. He just hovered, his presence a silent threat and a dark invitation. "I've spent 10 years listening to people scream in fear or beg for mercy," he whispered. "Do you have any idea what it does to a man like me to hear a woman whisper about his restraint and the heat in his eyes while she thinks he's not listening?" Ellen couldn't breathe. The secret was out, the monster was awake, and for the first time in her life, the girl who wanted to be invisible was the only thing in the world he was looking at. The air in the lobby had become a pressurized vacuum. Ellen's lungs burned, but she was too afraid to draw a full breath, terrified that the scent of him would finally, completely undo her. John McLean remained terrifyingly close, a wall of dark intent that blocked out the rest of the world. He was waiting for her to break, to cry, or to scream. But Ellen, despite the trembling in her soul, did something neither of them expected. She looked up. She forced her eyes to meet his, those piercing, predatory eyes that had seen the worst of humanity. For a fleeting second, the fear in her gaze was eclipsed by the very honesty he had overheard on the phone. "I meant it," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of defiance. "I'm sorry you heard it because it was private, but I meant every word." John's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, surprise? Hunger, rippling across his stoic features. His hand, still resting near the phone, twitched. Before he could respond, the heavy glass doors of the hotel main entrance swung open with a violent crash. The spell was shattered. Vincenzo Corleone burst into the lobby, his face a mask of uncharacteristic panic. He wasn't alone. 3 other men in dark overcoats followed, their hands tucked significantly into their waistbands. The calm, silent atmosphere of the Grand Pierre was instantly replaced by the jagged electricity of an impending hit. "John, we have a problem," Vincenzo barked, his eyes darting toward the elevators and then the street. "The Castiglione brothers just hit the warehouse in the docks. They're moving on the city blocks. You have to go. Now." John didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around immediately. He kept his gaze locked on Ellen for 3 more beats of her racing heart, a silent communication passing between them that said this isn't over. "The back exit," John commanded, finally turning to Vincenzo. His voice had shifted back into the steel-plated tone of a commander. "Get the SUVs to the service alley. We're not taking the main road." "John, they're already outside," Vincenzo hissed, stepping closer. "They knew we were at the Pierre. Someone leaked the suite number. We're boxed in." The revelation hit the room like a physical weight. A leak. In John McLean's world, a leak meant a death sentence for everyone in the vicinity. Suddenly, Ellen wasn't just a girl who had confessed her feelings. She was a witness to a tactical retreat, a civilian caught in the crosshairs of a mob war. "The girl," Vincenzo said, his eyes sliding to Ellen with cold, clinical detachment. He reached for the small of his back. "She's seen us. She knows we're compromised. We can't leave her behind to talk to the police or the Castigliones." Fear, real and cold, doused the heat of Ellen's confession. She saw the way Vincenzo looked at her, not as a person but as a loose end that needed to be tied. "No," John said. The word was a low vibrato growl that stopped Vincenzo's hand in its tracks. John, she's a liability. I said no, John repeated, stepping in front of the desk, shielding Ellen with his massive frame. She's coming with us. What? Ellen and Vincenzo gasped in unison. You heard me, John said, turning his head slightly to look at Ellen over his shoulder. If you stay here, the men coming through those doors will kill you just to see if you have any of my secrets. If you come with me, you might die anyway, but at least you'll have a choice. I have a shift, Ellen stammered, the absurdity of the statement hanging in the air. John actually let out a short, dark bark of a laugh. Forget the shift, Ellen. Your life as a receptionist ended the moment I heard that phone call. Now move. He didn't wait for her to agree. He reached over the counter, his large hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was firm, possessive, and exactly as powerful as she had imagined. He hauled her over the low section of the mahogany desk as if she weighed nothing. Her sensible flats hit the marble with a thud, and before she could catch her balance, she was being swept toward the service elevators. The lobby doors shattered. The sound of breaking glass was followed by the rapid-fire pop-pop-pop of suppressed weapons. Bullets whistled through the air, chewing into the expensive upholstery of the lobby chairs and shattering the vase of lilies Ellen had tended to only an hour ago. Down! John roared, shoving Ellen toward the floor while simultaneously drawing a heavy silver handgun from beneath his coat. He fired back with a precision that was terrifying to behold. He wasn't spraying bullets, he was picking targets. Each shot from his weapon was a deliberate punctuation mark in a conversation of violence. Ellen huddled on the floor, her hands over her ears, the smell of gunpowder and ozone filling her senses. This was the man she had dreamed about, not the romantic lead of a movie but a dealer of death. And yet, even as she trembled, she felt a sick, twisted sense of security because his body was a shield between her and the lead rain. Vincenzo, the freight lift! John shouted over the chaos. They scrambled toward the back of the lobby, dodging behind marble pillars. John never let go of Ellen's arm. He dragged her through the heavy steel doors of the service corridor, into the dark, echoing world of the hotel's underbelly. They reached the service alley just as two black SUVs screeched to a halt, tires smoking. The back door of the lead vehicle swung open. Get in, John ordered, shoving Ellen toward the dark leather interior. Where are we going? She cried, her voice cracking. John stepped into the car after her, slamming the door shut as bullets began to thud against the armored glass. He looked at her, his face splattered with a drop of someone else's blood, his eyes burning with a dark, predatory fire. To my world, Ellen, he said, the car lurching forward and throwing her against his chest. You wanted to be seen. You wanted to be known. Now you belong to the man you were so curious about. Let's see if you have the stomach for the truth. The SUV tore out of the alley, leaving the quiet life of Ellen Ripley behind in a cloud of exhaust and broken glass. She was no longer the girl behind the desk. She was the guest of a man who owned the city, and the inciting incident of her life had just begun with a literal bang. The SUV roared through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a blackened predator fleeing the light. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke. Ellen was pressed against the leather seat, the heat radiating from John McClane's body feeling like a physical brand against her side. Every time the driver, a silent man named Kaiser Soze, took a sharp turn to lose their pursuers, Ellen was tossed against John. Each time his arm would shoot out like a steel bar, pinning her safely against the seat, his touch both a rescue and a capture. Check the perimeter, John barked into a radio, his eyes never leaving the rear window. Vincenzo, if that tail isn't gone in 2 blocks, take the bridge. I want them in the water or in the dirt. Ellen watched him. The man she had mooned over from behind a mahogany desk was gone. In his place was a sovereign of chaos. He was checking a spare magazine, his movements methodical and chillingly calm. She realized then that her crush was a flame, and she was a moth that had finally reached the wick. You're shaking, John said, not looking at her. He slammed the magazine into his pistol with a hollow clack. I just saw a man get shot, John, she whispered, using his first name with a boldness that made Kaiser's eyes flicker to the rearview mirror. I've never seen blood that wasn't from a paper cut. John finally turned his head. The interior light of the passing street lamps strobed across his face, highlighting the harsh line of his jaw and the cold intensity of his eyes. You called me John. Not Mr. McLean. Not, sir. You're braver when you're terrified than most men are when they're armed. He reached out his hand, the one she had fantasized about, moving toward her face. Ellen froze, her heart stopping. He didn't grab her. Instead, his thumb brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. The intimacy of the gesture in the middle of a high-speed chase was more jarring than the gunfire had been. I'm not brave, she breathed, leaning unconsciously into his touch. I have nowhere else to go. You've taken my life away. I saved your life, he corrected, his voice dropping to that dangerous velvet register. The Castigliones don't leave witnesses. They would have peeled the skin off your bones just to find out why I was talking to a receptionist for 10 minutes. By bringing you here I made you mine. And in this city, being mine is the only thing that keeps you breathing. The SUV suddenly swerved, tires screaming as they veered into a hidden industrial park near the river. They pulled into a nondescript warehouse that looked like a rotting corpse of the shipping industry. But as the heavy steel doors rolled up, a different world was revealed. A high-tech fortress filled with monitors, weapon racks, and a dozen men who moved with military precision. Out, John commanded. As they stepped onto the concrete floor, the tension didn't dissipate, it evolved. The men in the warehouse stopped what they were doing, their eyes raking over Ellen. She felt like a lamb introduced to a wolf den. John, the situation at the docks is worse than we thought, Vincenzo said, walking over while wiping blood from a shallow graze on his forehead. He stopped when he saw Ellen standing there in her wrinkled hotel uniform. Why is she still here? We're at war, John. We don't have time to play house with a stray. John's eyes flashed with a lethal spark. She stays in the glass office. She doesn't leave my sight. If anyone has a problem with that, they can discuss it with the floor. The next few hours were a blur of escalating dread. While John coordinated a counterstrike, Ellen was kept in an elevated glass-walled office that overlooked the warehouse floor. She watched him work. He was a conductor of violence, moving maps, barking orders, and making life-and-death decisions with a flick of his pen. But every 20 minutes, without fail, John would look up. He would find her through the glass. He wouldn't smile. He wouldn't wave. He would just look. A long, lingering stare that felt like he was checking to see if she was still real, or if she had vanished like the dream he'd overheard on the phone. The romantic tension began to coil like a spring. Every time he entered the office to check the monitors, the small space felt like it was shrinking. At one point he brought her a bottle of water and a plain black hoodie. Put it on, he said. The hotel uniform makes you look like a victim. In my house you wear my colors. As she pulled the oversized hoodie over her head, the scent of him, that cedar and expensive tobacco, enveloped her. It felt like a heavy, dark embrace. You're watching me, he said, leaning against the desk, his presence looming over her. Even now. Why aren't you crying? Why aren't you begging to go home? Ellen stood her ground, the oversized sleeves covering her hands. Because I told you the truth on that phone call, John. I've spent my life being afraid of people who are loud and small like Biff. You're loud and big, but you're not small. I'm not afraid of the monster. I'm afraid of the way the monster makes me feel. John stepped closer, his chest inches from hers. He reached out and unpinned her hair, the tight bun falling away as her dark locks spilled over her shoulders. He threaded his fingers through the strands, his expression unreadable. You're a dangerous woman, Ellen Ripley, he whispered. Most people try to hide their heart from me. You handed me yours on a silver platter before I even knew your middle name. It's Marie, she whispered. Ellen Marie, he repeated, the name sounding like a prayer and a threat. But the moment was broken by a red herring that sent the warehouse into a frenzy. A scout reported that a convoy was heading toward Ellen's apartment. They're going to my home? Ellen shrieked, her face turning pale. My books. My cat. My whole life is there. John's face hardened. Vincenzo, take Team B. Intercept them. I want no survivors. As Vincenzo led a team out, the tension reached a breaking point. For 2 hours they waited for news. Ellen paced the glass office, her mind conjuring images of her small, peaceful apartment being torn apart. She felt the weight of her choice. By loving him, she had invited the devil into her living room. Finally, the radio crackled. It was a decoy, John. The apartment was empty. They leaked the location to draw us out. The real hit is moving toward the pier. John swore, slamming his fist into the desk. He realized too late that he had been played. He had sent half his men to protect a ghost, leaving the warehouse vulnerable. They're not after the docks, John realized, his eyes widening as he looked at Ellen. They're after the one thing they think I've become soft for. They're after you. Before he could react, the lights in the warehouse flickered and died. Red emergency lights kicked in, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. The sound of a thermal charge blowing the back entrance echoed through the building. The rising tension had reached its peak. The predator was being hunted, and the prize was the girl who had dared to love him. The red emergency lights bathed the warehouse in the color of a fresh wound. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and the high-pitched whine of electronics short-circuiting. Down on the warehouse floor, John's remaining men scrambled into defensive positions. But the silence following the explosion was even more terrifying than the blast itself. John grabbed Ellen by the waist, his arm like a band of iron, and yanked her away from the glass. "Stay low. Do not move unless I tell you to," he commanded. He wasn't looking at her with the smoldering intensity of a lover anymore. He was a general in the middle of a slaughterhouse. "John, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the backup generators. "A betrayal," he spat, his eyes scanning the darkness below. The Castigliones couldn't have bypassed the exterior sensors without a key code. "Someone inside sold us out." Suddenly, the monitors in the office flickered to life, bypassed by a remote signal. Instead of the security feeds, a grainy video appeared. It showed a high-angle shot of the hotel lobby from earlier that evening, specifically the moment Ellen had been on the phone. But this wasn't the hotel's security footage. It was a private recording, taken from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The audio began to play, but it wasn't just Ellen's voice. It was another voice, a man's voice, responding to her in real time but not on the phone. "She's perfect, isn't she? So vulnerable. So easy to break." Ellen's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice. It wasn't John's. It was Biff Tannen, her manager from the hotel. But he didn't sound like the bumbling, sweaty bully she knew. He sounded cold, calculated, and terrifyingly literate. The video shifted. It showed Biff standing in a dark room speaking to someone off camera. "I've spent a year grooming her, making her feel small, making her look for a hero. I knew the moment McLean saw her, he'd see a mirror of his own isolation. She was the bait, and she didn't even know she was fishing." John froze. The hand that had been reaching for a spare weapon stopped midair. He turned to the screen, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were vibrating with a lethal, agonizing realization. "John." Ellen reached out, her fingers trembling. I don't know what that is. I don't know him." The video continued. Biff stepped into the light, and beside him stood Vincenzo Corleone, John's right-hand man. The man who had just led half the security team away on a wild goose chase. "The girl was the play, Vincenzo," Biff's recorded voice said. "John is too smart to hit directly. You have to compromise his heart. You make him hear a confession he can't ignore, you make him feel protective of something fragile, and then you strike when he's looking at her instead of the door." The revelation shattered everything. The accident of the open phone line hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a setup. Biff wasn't a hotel manager. He was an operative for the Castiglione family. And Vincenzo, the man John trusted with his life, had been the one to leave the line open on the other end to ensure John heard every word. The romantic connection that had been blooming between them, the shared vulnerability, the heat, the feeling that they were two souls finally finding a home, was suddenly tainted. It felt like a staged play. John turned to Ellen. The heat in his eyes was gone, replaced by a devastating, glacial vacuum. He looked at her as if she were a weapon that had just been used to stab him in the back. "Did you know?" he asked. The question was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. "No. John, I swear to God, I thought I was calling Sarah. I thought." "Is there even a Sarah?" he roared, stepping toward her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip no longer protective but accusatory. "Or is she just another ghost in the machine? Did they pay you? Did they promise you a way out of that desk job if you played the part of the pining, innocent girl?" "No." Ellen cried, tears finally breaking free. "I loved you before I even knew your name. I didn't need a script for that. Everything I said, Every word about your hands, about wanting you to see me. That was real. They used my heart against us. The vulnerability in her voice was raw, bleeding, and unmistakable. John stared at her, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He wanted to believe her, she could see it in the way his jaw worked, but he was a man who had survived by never trusting anyone. To trust her now was to admit he was weak. "They're coming," John said, his voice dead. He looked at the monitors, which now showed Vincenzo and a dozen armed men entering the warehouse's main bay. "They didn't come to kill me. They came to watch me realize I was fooled by a girl with a soft voice." He leaned in close, his forehead pressing against hers. For a moment the passion returned, but it was a dark, twisted version of it. A desperate need to claim something that was about to be destroyed. "If you're lying to me, Ellen Marie," he whispered against her lips, "I'll make sure you're the last thing I kill before I go down. But if you're telling the truth, if you're really just a girl who fell for a monster." He pulled back, his hands sliding down to grip his weapon. "Then I'm going to burn this entire city to the ground to keep you." The stakes had never been higher. The betrayal of his closest ally and the manipulation of her deepest feelings had turned their budding romance into a tragedy of errors. They were trapped in the glass office, surrounded by enemies, with the foundation of their trust reduced to ash. The glass of the office window suddenly shattered as a bullet tore through it, narrowly missing John's head. "John." Vincenzo's voice boomed from the warehouse floor, amplified by the acoustics of the metal building. "Give us the girl and the codes to the offshore accounts, and maybe I'll let you die with a shred of dignity. You fell for a receptionist, John. You're pathetic." John looked at Ellen. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the unwavering love she still held for him even now, even after he doubted her. In that moment of shared vulnerability amidst the flying glass, the stakes reached their absolute zenith. He didn't answer Vincenzo. He just grabbed Ellen, pulled her behind a reinforced steel desk and kissed her. A hard, desperate, soul-searing kiss that tasted of salt and gunpowder. It was a kiss that said, "I believe you, and also we're probably going to die." The kiss ended as abruptly as the world was falling apart. The silence of the warehouse was replaced by a rhythmic, heavy thud, the sound of tactical boots advancing on all sides. The glass office, once a sanctuary of observation, had become a translucent cage. "John, look at me," Ellen whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes fixed on his. "You have to go. You have the codes, you have the strength. If you stay here trying to protect me, they'll get everything." John didn't even look at the door. He was reloading his secondary weapon, his movements robotic. "I don't leave what's mine. I'm not a possession, John. I'm the reason you're going to lose," she cried, the despair finally breaking through her resolve. "Vincenzo knows your heart is the only weakness you have. If I stay with you, I am the bullet they used to kill you." The separation began not with distance, but with the brutal reality of their situation. John looked at the monitors. The back exit was blocked. The service tunnel was rigged with explosives. They were pinned in a glass box 30 feet above a floor crawling with men who had spent years learning how to kill from John himself. Suddenly the overhead sprinklers hissed to life. But it wasn't water. The sharp, chemical tang of gasoline filled the air. "They're going to burn us out," John hissed. Vincenzo's voice drifted up again, cold and mocking. "You always said a leader should be prepared to cauterize a wound, John. The girl is the infection. I'm just the surgeon." A grenade, gas, not fragmentation, shattered the remaining glass of the office. White, choking smoke billowed in, stinging Ellen's eyes and lungs. In the chaos of the coughing and the blinding haze, a hand reached through the smoke. Not John's hand. "John!" Ellen screamed as she was yanked backward. John lunged through the smoke, his gunfire lighting up the white cloud like strobes, but he was met with a wall of lead. He was forced to dive behind the steel desk as bullets chewed the metal to pieces. "Ellen!" he roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that no one in the city had ever heard from the Ice King. By the time the smoke cleared slightly, the office was empty. Ellen was gone. She was dragged down the metal stairs, her feet kicking uselessly against the grates. Vincenzo held her by the hair, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. He dragged her to the center of the warehouse floor, right into the kill zone where John would have to come for her. "Look at her, John!" Vincenzo shouted, pressing the barrel of a pistol against Ellen's temple. "Look at the little bird you thought could fly in your sky." From the shadows of the office balcony, John appeared. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his face smeared with soot and sweat. He looked down at the woman he had just begun to know, the woman who had accidentally confessed her soul to him, and for the first time in his life, John McClane felt the paralyzing weight of helplessness. "Let her go, Vincenzo," John said, his voice strangely calm. It was the calm of a man who had already accepted his own death. "The accounts are yours. The routes, the docks, the city, take it all. Just let her walk." "No, John. Don't." Ellen screamed before Vincenzo backhanded her, sending her sprawling onto the cold, gasoline-slicked concrete. "You don't get it, do you?" Vincenzo laughed. "It was never just about the money. It was about proving you're human. Once the world sees you groveling for a receptionist, your empire is dead anyway. I don't need to let her walk. I need to let her burn." Vincenzo pulled a silver lighter from his pocket. He flicked it. The small, dancing flame reflected in the pools of fuel surrounding Ellen. This was the darkest hour. John was out of ammunition, surrounded by 20 armed traitors, and the woman who loved him was seconds away from becoming a human torch. The isolation was total. The romantic dream had turned into a pyre. Ellen looked up at John, her face bruised, her spirit breaking. She didn't beg for her life. "It's okay, John," she mouthed through the tears. "I saw you. That's enough." The situation was hopeless. The antagonist held every card, the fuel was spreading, and the hero was broken. As Vincenzo prepared to drop the lighter, the heavy silence of the warehouse felt like the end of the world. The flame from Vincenzo's lighter danced, a tiny, flickering demon ready to devour the world. Ellen lay in the cooling slick of fuel, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against the concrete. She looked up at John, expecting to see the face of a man defeated. But something had shifted. The despair that had clouded John's eyes moments ago had crystallized into something far more dangerous. Clarity. "You're right about one thing, Vincenzo," John said, his voice echoing with a haunting, hollow resonance. "A leader should be prepared to cauterize a wound. But you forgot who the infection is." In that split second, Ellen saw John's hand move behind his back, not for a gun, but for the manual override lever of the warehouse's industrial ventilation system, a secret he'd kept even from his inner circle. "Ellen, hold your breath," he roared. As Vincenzo dropped the lighter, John slammed the lever down. Instead of the fire spreading, a massive, localized blast of CO2 from the fire suppression vents hit the floor. The concentrated gas didn't just extinguish the lighter's flame. It created a blinding, freezing fog that obscured everything in a 10-foot radius. The turning point was instantaneous. The sheer audacity of the move stunned the traitors for the 2 seconds John needed. He didn't jump from the balcony. He slid down a structural cable with the grace of a falling star, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. In the whiteout of the CO2 fog, Ellen felt a pair of powerful arms wrap around her. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder returned, stronger than ever. "I've got you," John whispered into her ear, his voice a lifeline in the dark. He didn't just pull her up. He shielded her body with his own as the fog began to clear. But they weren't alone. The sound of heavy machinery groaning to life filled the warehouse. The massive steel doors at the far end didn't just open, they were breached. A black armored transport slammed through the entrance, followed by a fleet of motorcycles. These weren't Castiglione men. They wore the sigil of the Earp family, a rival syndicate that John had secretly spent the last hour negotiating with via his encrypted watch while Ellen was being dragged down the stairs. "John, we're here," a voice boomed. It was Wyatt Earp, a man John had once saved in a back-alley deal years ago. The debt was being paid in full. Vincenzo scrambled back, his face pale as he realized the tide had turned. "Kill them. Kill them all," he screamed to his men, but the traitors were already wavering. They had signed up for a slaughter, not a war with two syndicates. John stood in the center of the chaos, one arm locked firmly around Ellen's waist, the other holding a recovered submachine gun. He looked at her, and for the first time since the phone call, there was no doubt in his eyes. Only a fierce, protective love that burned brighter than any fire Vincenzo could have started. "You said you wanted to be the reason I stopped looking at the world like a chessboard," John said, his chest heaving as he pulled her closer. "Look at me, Ellen. The board is gone. There's only you." The realization hit Ellen with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't just saved her. He had dismantled his own life, his own secrets, and his own pride to ensure her safety. He had trusted a girl who was supposed to be a trap, and in doing so he had found the only thing that could actually save him. His humanity. "I'm here, John," she cried, her hands gripping his tactical vest. "I'm not going anywhere." "Then hold on," he said, a grim, beautiful smile touching his lips. "Because we're going to finish this." The hope that had been extinguished was roaring back to life. They were no longer the predator and the prey. They were a united front. The key to solving the conflict wasn't a code or a bullet. It was the fact that John McClane finally had something worth living for, and that made him the most dangerous man on the planet. The final confrontation was set. The traitors were cornered, the cavalry had arrived, and the woman who forgot to end the call was now the heart of the storm. If you're yet to subscribe at this point, please like the video and subscribe. Also tell me your name in the comments section and tell me if there is any story you would like me to tell you next time. The warehouse transformed from a tomb into a theater of war. The air was a cacophony of screeching tires, the staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire, and the metallic groans of a structure under siege. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange, focused silence between John and Ellen. They were the eye of the hurricane. John didn't let her go. He moved with her as if they were a single entity, his body a living shield of muscle and Kevlar. "Stay behind me, Ellen. Step where I step," he commanded. Every time a traitor leveled a weapon at them, John was faster. He fired with a cold, surgical precision that wasn't born of malice, but of a desperate primal need to clear a path to safety for the woman who had redefined his world. Vincenzo, realizing his coup was disintegrating, retreated toward the back offices where the main server banks and the escape tunnel were located. "Cover me," he shrieked at his remaining loyalists. "He's going for the accounts," John hissed. "If he gets those codes, he can disappear and hunt us from the shadows for the rest of our lives. We end this here." They fought their way through the bay, the Earp family's motorcycles circling the perimeter like sharks. John used a series of tactical flashbangs to blind the remaining guards, the white light illuminating Ellen's face in brief, jagged bursts. She wasn't the timid receptionist anymore. Though she didn't have a gun, she was his eyes, calling out movement in the rafters, her voice steady despite the adrenaline-fueled shaking of her limbs. They reached the elevated walkway leading to the server room. Vincenzo stood at the end of it, a terminal in one hand and a detonator in the other. "One more step and I blow the foundation, John," Vincenzo roared. "I'll take us all down. You, the girl, the money, everything buried under 10 tons of concrete." John stopped. He lowered his weapon, but he didn't look afraid. He looked disappointed. "You always were a bad student, Vincenzo. You think the money is what makes the man. You think the codes are the power. They are the power." Vincenzo screamed, his thumb hovering over the red button. "No," John said, stepping forward, pulling Ellen with him. He didn't hide her. He showed her to Vincenzo, showed him the woman who had survived the gasoline, the fog, and the fire. "The power is having something you're willing to die for. You're just a man afraid of being poor. I'm a man who just found a reason to live. Who do you think is more dangerous?" In that moment of psychological tension, the most surprising twist of the night occurred. The monitors behind Vincenzo, which had been scrolling through the account transfers, suddenly turned bright red. A flashing icon appeared: "Access denied." Vincenzo froze. "What? No. I had the codes. I saw them." Ellen stepped out from behind John's shoulder, her face bruised but her eyes shining with a sharp, unexpected intelligence. "The phone call, Vincenzo," she said, her voice ringing through the warehouse. "You were so busy listening to me talk about John's hands and his voice that you didn't pay attention to what I was doing while I talked." John looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I was at the front desk," Ellen continued, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I have access to every guest's digital footprint at the Pierre. When I realized the call was being tapped by the suite's private line, I didn't just keep talking to confess my love. I kept talking to keep you on the line long enough for me to upload a recursive logic bomb into the hotel's outgoing data stream. I knew whoever was listening would try to use that connection to steal John's data eventually. I locked your access 3 hours ago." John let out a low, disbelieving whistle. The quiet receptionist hadn't just been a pining lover. She had been a silent guardian. She had used the very moment of her greatest vulnerability to build a digital fortress around him. Vincenzo's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the detonator, then at the terminal, then at the man and woman standing before him. He had been outplayed by the goldfish. In a final desperate act of spite, Vincenzo lunged forward, aiming his pistol at Ellen. John didn't hesitate. He didn't fire his gun. He threw it, the heavy metal frame striking Vincenzo's wrist with a sickening crack. As the traitor stumbled, John was on him. It wasn't a clean, cinematic fight. It was a brutal, visceral reclamation of honor. John hit him with the weight of every lie Vincenzo had told, every betrayal he had orchestrated. With a final, thunderous blow, John sent Vincenzo over the railing. The traitor fell 30 feet, landing in the very pool of gasoline he had intended for Ellen. He didn't die, but as the Earp family moved in to zip-tie him, it was clear his reign was over. He was a broken man in a ruined kingdom. John turned back to Ellen. The warehouse was quiet now, save for the distant sirens and the crackle of cooling metal. He walked toward her, his boots echoing on the metal walkway. He reached out his large, scarred hands, the ones she had dreamed about, finally cupping her face with a tenderness that felt like a benediction. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Not just from the money, from myself." "I told you," she breathed, leaning her forehead against his. "I've been watching you for a long time, John McClane. I knew you were worth it." In the middle of the wreckage, under the flickering red lights of a dying fortress, they shared a kiss that wasn't born of desperation or fear. It was a kiss of triumph, of justice, and of a love that had been forged in the most high-stakes fire imaginable. The first rays of dawn began to bleed through the high, shattered windows of the warehouse, cutting through the lingering haze of smoke and CO2. The light was pale and gold, a stark contrast to the violent red that had dominated the night. Outside, the world was waking up, unaware that the hierarchy of the city's shadows had been completely rewritten. John didn't let go of Ellen's hand as they walked out of the warehouse. He didn't need to. The way her fingers interlaced with his, fitting perfectly into the gaps between his calluses, was a silent testament to a bond that had been hardened in a furnace. 3 months later, the world looked very different for Ellen Marie Ripley. She was no longer sitting behind a mahogany desk at the Grand Pierre. She stood on the deck of a sleek white vessel anchored in the Mediterranean, the salt air tossing her dark hair, now worn loose and free, around her shoulders. She wore a simple silk dress the color of the ocean, a far cry from the stiff polyester uniform that had once been her armor. But the change wasn't just physical. The girl who had once kept her eyes down now moved with a quiet, grounded confidence. She had seen the worst of the world and the best of a man, and she was no longer afraid of either. John walked out from the cabin carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He had traded his tailored wool suits for a linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars on his forearms, scars that Ellen now knew the stories of. He looked younger, the permanent tension in his jaw having finally surrendered to the peace of their new life. He had dismantled his empire, liquidating his assets and turning the codes into a foundation that funded anonymous shelters for foster children. A nod to the childhood Ellen had survived. "You're thinking again," John said, sliding an arm around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his scent, now more sandalwood than gunpowder, enveloping her. "I was just thinking about that phone call," she admitted, leaning back into his strength. "About how terrified I was when I realized you heard me. I thought I had destroyed my life." John turned her in his arms, his expression becoming uncharacteristically soft. "You didn't destroy it, Ellen. You started it. I spent 40 years surrounded by people who wanted something from me, loyalty, money, or my life. You were the first person who just wanted me. Without the crown. Without the shadow." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. They had already been through enough drama to last 10 lifetimes. He simply opened it to reveal a ring. A deep, sea-blue sapphire flanked by diamonds that caught the morning sun. "I've spent my life taking things," John said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant rumble that still made her heart skip a beat. "But I'm asking for this. I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never feel invisible again. Ellen Marie, will you stay with me? Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you belong." Tears pricked Ellen's eyes, but they were tears of fulfillment, not fear. I've belonged to you since the first day you walked into that lobby, John. I just didn't think you'd ever find out. I'm glad I'm a good listener, he whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. The resolution was complete. Vincenzo and Biff were serving life sentences in a high-security facility, their names forgotten by the city they tried to steal. The Earp family maintained the balance of power in the streets, but John McClane was a ghost. A legend whispered about in bars, the man who walked away from a throne for the love of a girl who forgot to hang up the phone. As the boat began to move, heading toward a horizon that promised nothing but new beginnings, Alan looked at John and saw not a boss, not a monster, but her partner. The quiet girl had found her voice and the Mafia boss had found his soul. The truth had been heard, and for once the truth had set them both free. Thank you so much for following this journey with me. If you're yet to subscribe at this point, please like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Also, please tell me your name in the comment section and tell me if there is any story you would like me to tell you next time. I read every single one of your suggestions.